Thank you very, very much for joining us this morning for this amazing panel discussion about all good things come to an end, closing a museum well, with our three fantastic speakers, Lorenda, Karin, and Lauren. Right now, I am going to start with the land acknowledgement. As an organization of provincial scope, the Ontario Museum Association recognizes that its members and communities live and work on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples. We are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for these territories since time immemorial. And who continue to contribute to all communities across the province. We acknowledge that there are more than 40 treaties and other land agreements that cover Ontario, and that the descendants and cultures of the first peoples who lived here are a vibrant and integral part of our society today. We gratefully acknowledge and deeply, deeply value the opportunity we have to learn from and cherish the contributions of Indigenous peoples of the past, present, and into the future. As we acknowledge the colonial legacy of museums, we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. As you participate in this gathering, we invite you to reflect on the land that you are on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, and what the treaty relationship is, or if unceded territory. Toronto, where the OMA offices are, is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Hongwanji, the Huron-Wendat. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and also is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. So thank you very much. Now, I know all of us, since COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, we have done Zoom meetings, Zoom AGMs, Zoom-based lectures, Zoom-based webinars. So we all know how to use Zoom, but just in case, please, if you have a question, do not hesitate to put it in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to chit chat with your friends and colleagues, you can have a conversation in the chat box. If you put a question in the chat box, Christopher or Jessica will move it over to the Q&A for us. And I will keep an eye on all the questions in the Q&A box. Also, if you want to turn on the automated closed captions, you can do so by clicking on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. OMA staff, Christopher, Jessica, Jennifer, will be monitoring all of the icons. And if you have a technical question, they'll take care of it for you. It is now my true pleasure. I'm just overjoyed to be able to introduce you to our three speakers this morning. I'm going to do each speaker one at a time, and they will have 3 or 4 minutes to introduce themselves and their organization, and to tell you why they have come to this discussion. So I'm going to start with Karin. Karin Kierstead is with the Association of Nova Scotia Museums. Karin is the programs manager and has been working with the Association of Nova Scotia Museums for well over 20 years. Has worked with museums and heritage organizations in 4 provinces over those 20 years. I'm sorry, I correct myself, Karin. She manages the Association of Nova Scotia Museums track, as well as internship programs, and the novamuse.ca. and the collective access database systems that feed this provincial collections portal. She provides advice and support to museums across Nova Scotia, actively assisting them in improving their museological practices in all areas of their operations. Now, this one I find personally fascinating and gives me a lot of happiness. Karin is also the founder of an international discussion group for museum association and government agencies that deliver database services to museums in their provinces. Her work on novamuse.ca earned the Association of Nova Scotia Museums a Canadian Museums Association Award of Outstanding Achievement in Management. Karin is an expert on information standards and collections management and regularly provides advice to heritage groups across North America. She is well known throughout North America. And with regard to online collaboration projects, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Karin. Karin, the virtual mic is yours.
Thanks, Robin. I'm old. I'm not that old, guys. Although with that that long list of stuff, I can see it does make me feel old. I'm really pleased to be with you all today. We've got a really interesting conversation ahead of us. Thinking about what brought me to the table today. In Nova Scotia, we've been talking a lot about organizational life cycles. These conversations have been going on for a long time now, and every once in a while they will include questions from our member museums about what it would mean to close. You know, that is that option on the table. What would that look like? What, you know, how would this work? 100% of these conversations come from curators and or board members who are feeling really burnt out. They are overworked, or they feel like maybe they're stuck in a rut and they're just not sure how to get out of that and how to shift how the museum has been operating. We have a lot of museums in Nova Scotia. We're a small province, but like throw a rock and there's going to be a museum nearby. We really only have one go-to example from the early 2000s in terms of a museum that actually closed. It was a really small community museum. They were able to transfer their entire collection to a nearby museum, and then through their small town network, they could handle all of the like legal and other requirements for closure. At this point, though, that's more of like this fading story. It's almost like museum mythology because it's so long ago and there have been so many changes in the field. So it's not a really great case study for us to go to. But leading up to COVID, we had, you know, calls from museums. They're questioning their future. During COVID, they're like, wow, what's the impact going to be? So the question has bubbled to the surface again. I'd say during COVID, we noticed that the museums we thought would be able to easily pivot and thrive in community service sometimes just froze. They weren't really sure what to do. And then there were others that we thought, oh, wow, these guys are really, really going to struggle. And they turned into these shining examples of community-based organizations and service. So that was really interesting to watch and to talk about with our members. We did have one museum that ended up closing during COVID. Again, it was a really small community group. They were never a member of ANSM. They were never engaged in the broader heritage community. They just kind of did their own thing. And thankfully that was a fairly easy closure process, which is outlined for you in our museum life cycle toolkit. How's that for a segue? All of those experiences.
Okay, and on that note, I'll move on to
Right.
to Lauren, because hold that thought, because that's a critical piece of information and discussion point. So thank you, Karin. That's
You're
excellent.
welcome.
Lauren Wheeler is with the Alberta Museums Association. Lauren is a public historian, with over 20 years experience in a wide range of museums and heritage institutions in Alberta. She has worked at the Alberta Museums Association since 2013, beginning as program lead overseeing accreditation through the Recognized Museum program, and now as strategic services director. She holds a Master of Arts in Public History from Carleton University in Ottawa, which is just a fantastic program. And Lauren is passionate about the role museums to change society and the importance of repatriation and deaccessioning in maintaining a healthy institution. A settler to Canada, Lauren was raised in Canmore, Alberta, on Treaty 7 territory, and currently resides in Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. And Lauren, the virtual mic is yours. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for that introduction, Robin, and thank you for having me. I am joining you from our offices here in Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homeland, and current home for the Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Dakota Sioux, as well as the Dene and the Inuit.
Thank
So
you.
I am here because I spent a lot of time as program lead engaging with museums across Alberta through our accreditation program. And as anyone who administers an accreditation program will tell you, and I'm sure Karin will feel the same, when you're in that position, you see the good, the bad, and the ugly of every institution that comes through the program. And my role wasn't to say you were accredited. My role was to assist our members in becoming accredited, working through whatever problems they were facing, helping them understand what does best practice look like for them. How do they adapt what you should be doing to what they can do within their capacity. And through that, I've come to really respect and be fascinated by the idea of endings. Endings not as closure, but endings as something stopping and something else beginning. Because within accreditation, I saw a lot of institutions that could have closed choose another path. Choose to enter a phase of what we call renewal within our organizational life cycle structure, instead of simply saying we give up, choosing to end practices that weren't working in favor of practices that helped them maintain themselves and be more self-sufficient. But I also, shortly before the pandemic, worked very closely with institutions who had to make the decision to close. All of those experiences, coupled with my just general fascination with deaccessioning and repatriation and making your collection as relevant as possible to what you want to do, has kind of positioned me here today. Like I said, right before the pandemic, I worked very closely with the Telephone Historical Center here in Edmonton as they made the really difficult decision and then went through the closure process. What was interesting about that is it really helped us as an association rethink our approach to closure and our approach to how do we talk about closure. We have a publication from 2003 called Thinking About Starting a Museum, which is my go-to scare people out of starting a museum reference point. Everyone is allowed to use it. It's free on our website. And we'd always had this idea that we would do a companion piece. Even in 2003, the plan was there will be a closing museum companion to this document. And as we walked through the process with the Telephone Historical Center, and we brought that learning to what we'd learned in the floods of 2013, in our conversations around sustainability that we've been having since the Sustainability Working Group report, again in 2013, we came to realize that anything to do with closure also has to revisit starting. And anything that revisits starting also has to revisit standards. So for us, the process to getting to having a good reference point that is explicitly about closure is now connected back into our approach to standards and our standard practices handbook, which is due for another edition and review. So I come here today with the kind of experience of listening and walking the path of closure with some of our members, as well as walking with some of our members as they have avoided closure in a variety of different ways, and kind of rediscovered what their institutions can do.
Thank you, Lauren. That's fantastic. And hold that thought because we're going to revisit it as well. So thank you. Lorenda Calvert is with the British Columbia Museums Association. Lorenda has a passion for informal education and cross-generational learning. Her previous role as Education and Public Program Coordinator at Burnaby Village Museum honed her skills of creating engaging educational opportunities and fostering connections between students, community groups, informal educators, and members of the public. Lorenda believes that we are all lifelong learners and encourage everyone to seek out opportunities that inspire us. So please join me in welcoming Lorenda. And Lorenda, the virtual mic is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm joining you this morning from my home here in Victoria on the traditional unceded territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, which is also the location of the BCMA's office. As Robin said, thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Lorenda Calvert. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the programs manager with the BC Museums Association. I'm delighted to be joining Karin and Lauren here today, as well as all of you for this session. And I also feel like I need to write a better introduction to myself. Karin and Lauren, your bios are so wonderful and detailed and lengthy. I will be making a little note for after the session to maybe expand on mine. But that gives me an opportunity to tell you verbally a little bit more about myself and my role with the BCMA. Just as a quick visual description, I have long blonde hair. I have pale, fair skin. My hair is straight today and tossed over my shoulders. I'm wearing my blue light glasses, and I recently just got braces. So I'm smiling at you with all my teeth with navy blue braces. And I am wearing a striped black and blue sweater this morning. I joined the BCMA in March of 2020. And previously was at the Burnaby Village Museum. Most of my work experience in this sector has been in the education side of working in municipal museums. And I was really delighted to join the BCMA, but it was my first time where I was going to be working in supporting our membership and supporting museums as opposed to being one of those members who work in museums. And I started a week before the pandemic, which was a very stressful but interesting time. And because of the pandemic, the conversation of what are we going to do if museums in our community face closure was something we were talking about. And it was something I'd never explored before. I didn't have any information in, but did lead me down a path of research to find out what would we need to know and how can we support our membership if they do face closure due to the pandemic, which resulted in a yet unpublished resource called Sunsetting Your Site that will be on our website shortly, that details what that looks like and how to support organizations and aspects beyond just your collection or the legal aspects. Because my background is in people and education, I really wanted to know what happens to your staff, your volunteers, and your members, and how best to support them through that transition, which has led me here to this session today. And that will be my transition, Robin, for our next section. I'm so delighted to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, Lorenda. That's great. Just to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A icon. And if you have any technical problems, just put it in the chat box and Christopher will help you out. I'm going to move, actually, I'm going to modify the first question because, which is about why you are here. Why are you coming to this discussion? And I'm going to add, though, because you started talking about the resources that our colleagues can access to help them better understand the process of closing a museum or their options. So I think all of you have reports and guidelines that you have worked on and that are available for public reading. So if you could start that conversation amongst yourselves, that would be great. And Karin, since you were on the verge of talking about your guidelines, we'll start with you, and thank you all very much.
All right. Yeah, so like I was starting to say, all of those experiences and those conversations that had been swirling led us to hire a consultant. We got a provincial grant, and we hired a consultant to develop a museum life cycle toolkit. We released that last year. It was part of some advocacy efforts around museum funding in the province that was put into question. So we thought, here's a good time. This will scare them. And it did. We didn't want this toolkit, though, to be seen as encouraging museums to close. Kind of like Lauren was saying, there are so many options out there, and we just wanted museums to feel encouraged to have some real and informed conversations about where they were at in their organizational life cycle and what some other museums have done when they've been faced with those questions. So, what are the options that exist? We saw this as a companion piece to an earlier toolkit we did on reconciling old loans. It felt very similar in encouraging museums to face an elephant in the room that many feel ill-equipped or overwhelmed to actually confront. And the two of them can really work in tandem, because obviously the old loans, like, you got to deal with that. Whether you're going to close or not, you got to deal with that. So we went back to the same lawyer and said we wanted to explore this kind of from another angle, and look at closures and understand the implications. So yeah, and the link has just been put into the chat for you.
There you go. Thank you, Karin. Lauren?
Well, we have Thinking About Starting a Museum from 2003, which is actually a really good resource for if you're thinking of starting a museum. It lays out everything you have to consider, and I kind of say jokingly that I use it to scare people out of starting museums.
Yep.
But it's because a lot of people looking at the other side of closure, which is starting, think that it's really easy to be a museum. You just open your doors and the people come, and you give them a document like that, and it gives them a chance to pause and think. The other reason that I bring that up is because closure is really the reverse of opening. So anything you would have to consider in opening a museum, you have to consider in closing a museum. So in that way, this now dated document that, yes, we know we need to update, doesn't even have our right logo on it, or name, from the brief period we were Museums Alberta. From those times, it really speaks to something, and we're at a different point now, and we're at a point where, as the AMA, we rely on our standard practices handbook to lead people through closure. Specifically, we rely on the section that speaks to organizational life cycle, because when you look at each part of that life cycle, it helps give you an idea of what to do. And then, it's a tome. You go further in, it tells you what steps to take. And then we also have as a resource our HELP Museum's Guide to Emergency Preparedness, which, while it's not about closure explicitly, there are many aspects to preparing for an emergency, recovering from an emergency, that are really relevant to what does closure look like, especially around how do you communicate it and how do you prepare for it. We really strongly believe that you can plan for anything, you can prepare for anything, and that the more work you do in advance, the stronger you are to begin with. So between the Standard Practice Handbook, the resources from HELP, and then our Sustainability Working Group report, we use those three in combination to help guide our members to the right solution for them when they're faced with, do we renew or do we close?
Great, thank you. And Lorenda?
I think Lauren and Karin will touch on this more as we discussed during the session, but like Lauren said, when you are planning to open a museum is the right time to think about what does this look like when you close a museum. And with the draft of our resources and with the resources available, the creation of ours is so that you can think about this before you're in panic mode, before you are now facing closure and you are spinning off in 1,000 ways to think about how you can prevent this, how you can transition, how you can come back from this, or how you're going to move forward with this. Having these resources available, joining webinars like the one you're on now, and thinking about what this could look like in planning right now when you hopefully are not facing closure so you can prepare for it, I think is one of the biggest sentiments that I hope participants take away from this webinar, that when you are opening a museum, using the amazing Alberta Museums Association resource, which we share with folks who are interested in opening museums in BC, is the time that you should be thinking about it. And then if it's not when you are opening it, your first AGM is the time you should be talking about it. If it's not the first AGM, the second one. And if it's not then today, after this meeting, maybe you should go and think about, what does a closure plan look like? What are the resources that are now available in the chat laying up for me? And if I can get that ball rolling.
That's great. I'm going to combine the two next questions that I see because they're sort of the yin yang, other side of the question. Anyway, what forces a museum to close, and what does closing a museum look like? And who would like to take that one on? Okay, I'll choose. Karin, you can. I'll keep the cycle going here.
I was thinking somebody else might like to go first this time. I'll share a couple of thoughts on what forces a museum to close, and maybe we can spin off from there. So I think I don't really like that language, because I wouldn't actually say that anything in particular or any one thing forces a museum to close. In our experience, the ones that have been talking about this are the ones that have over the years been working in kind of like ever decreasing circles, meaning that they went from being really actively engaged in their community life to kind of pulling back as, resources get fewer and far between, or you lose some key volunteers, or there's a staff change or board change or whatever. Some museums have become a lot more inward focused on what's going on behind the scenes, and they've been decreasing their public visibility, which ends up decreasing the level of support that they have from the community and the engagement they have in the community. Sometimes that's really, really intentional. Like I said, you lose some resources and, okay, guys, we got to pull back. Whereas other times it's just a byproduct of your reality. But to the public, I think that can really kind of send a message that the museum is more of a club, that it's a special interest group, or it's not really open to new ideas or new people getting involved, and then it sort of can snowball from there. Again, that's just kind of what we've witnessed in Nova Scotia. I'm sure other places and other examples have different realities. How's that to kickstart?
Thank you, Karin. Does anybody, Lauren, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to build off what Karin has said, in our experience, it's very similar. There's nothing that really forces a museum to close, but there are a lot of decisions that are made that will potentially lead to closure. And the one that we see over and over again is institutions neglecting their communities and losing relevance. Those are the two biggest things. When Karin mentions a museum seeming like a club, an exclusive interest group, where the only people who go are those who are volunteering and interested in what they house. When an institution gets to that point, it's neglected its community beyond those of special interest, and it's beginning to lose relevance. And I think in kind of this privileged place as employees of museums associations, we get to see what's happening in institutions from 30,000 feet. And the common piece that happens every time we get a phone call about we might have to close, we're worried about closure, what does it look like, comes back to losing relevance in your community. And I'm just going to quickly shill for a project that all of our PTMAs were part of, and that's the Reconsidering Museums project. If anyone is wondering, how do we maintain our relevance? The PTMAs collaborated between 2019 and 2023 on a massive national project that ask that question to Canadians. It says, what do you value about museums? What makes them relevant? And if you're wondering if your institution is, take a look at those resources. And if you're wondering how you can be, we have resources for that too. A lot of tools in there to understand how to maintain your relevance. To me, those are the big things that lead a museum towards closure. But there's a lot of little things too, sometimes beyond museum's control. If your main funding source suddenly disappears, that can lead to a closure. And that is something that you can be as relevant as you want, as anyone. But if that source disappears, that's a very real threat. A natural disaster can also force you into a closure situation. And I'm sure Lorenda can speak to that in a bit more detail, as well as human resources issues. And just those little pieces of your operations that, if neglected or if they fall outside your control, if there aren't good enough safety nets built into your processes and your policies, they can very quickly take you from a place of strength to a place of we may have to close.
Thank you very much. Lorenda, I think Lauren gave you a segue into your comments.
She did. Just as Karen and Lauren said, there are, the people aspect and the funding aspect, but there is also the smaller things. Well, maybe not smaller, but losing your site. If your access to your building is a lease, and your lease is up and it's not renewed, and you can't find other locations to move into, having that relevance not only with your community, but with also staffing and volunteers, or if you don't have those people, and natural disasters. As we were moving into a time of more extreme weather events, something that BC is not unfamiliar with, and something that I know Alberta and Nova Scotia also have experienced very extreme weather events in the past few years. Your museum might be wiped off the surface of the planet. The Lytton Museum burnt down in a horrific wildfire 2 years ago, and was the whole town is completely wiped off. And that you might not have planned for a massive flood or forest fire to take your complete museum away. And while you are now dealing with your own relocation, you are thinking, what does that look like for my organization? And having a closure plan beforehand can help you transition through that. Although I'm sure your closure plan, if you wrote that before the natural disaster, had a bit more time where you thought you'd be able to work through this in your office with your collection. But there are the big things and there are the small things that can lead to an organization considering closure. And I think Karen's right. I think it's a consideration or a thought, not a forcing, that you are now working through this process.
Thank
I
you
was
very
just saying, I
much.
feel like what is coming through to me as everybody's talking here is just the importance of taking a much more holistic approach to all of our activities, instead of the tendency to sort of partition or silo them. Like, we think about collections through this one lens, but that's the work we do around collections has implications if we're having this discussion that we're having today, or the advocacy work or interpretation, whatever it might be. I think that that's a sort of mental shift that the sector just has to make.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move over. There's a question in the Q&A icon box from Fabiola, and it actually on one of your comments. One of the biggest losses that come along the closure of a museum is our human resources and our knowledge base. How do you foresee trying to recover that loss? My museum closed in 2020. The best museum technician I ever met moved on and became a trucker. Somehow, I cannot help but to think that it was a pity to lose that expertise and masterhood. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Who wants
Would
to go
anyone
first?
like to jump in with that one?
Oh,
Um, First of all, I'm sorry to hear about the closure of your museum. I hope it was not a force, but one that you had time to plan and prepare for. For me, thinking about the staff who are at organizations working in the sector, I know how many of us here and also the people that we work with are so deeply passionate about the work that they do at their organization. Um, I also know many folks, especially over the past 3 years, who have burnt out and transitioned out of the sector. When you are so deeply passionate about the work that you do, and you have things like a global pandemic, extreme weather events, or potential closure of the site that you're working at, I can imagine how that could make it a transition where you might want to take a step back. But I do think that is a really big, important section of closure plans and the discussions for your site is that's the people aspect. If you are running a site and you're thinking about that transition to closure, pre-planning on how you will support your staff through the next part of their career, whether that's like providing references, writing recommendations, helping them with their resumes beforehand. Something we touch on in our resources that a closure should not be a surprise for your staff. It should not be a surprise for your community, your staff, or your volunteers. If you are now working through the process of closure, everyone should know this so that they can make the preparations for what their next steps would look like as well. And I think it's a good point talking about the people that are absolutely incredible at the work that they do and wanting to ensure that that ends up somewhere at another organization if that's what they're interested in. And if you are not in panic mode and able to make these steps, you can set them up for what that transition, that success might look like. One of the trickiest things about a closure is that you do need staff to close. You need people on hand to make those to enact your plan. So you are asking people to stay until the time where things are done before they move on, which leaves them with this gap where they feel like they, often are very supportive of their organization and want to be here for that transition, but do have to kind of think about what, does job seeking look like? What does applying to jobs look like? And what happens if you get offered a job before the closure is completed? Um, and that is things that should be discussed openly with your staff. Karin or Lauren, I don't want to go through all of the points and then you have nothing to add.
um, I think what I would add there is that with this particular question, I wish we could ask follow-up questions to the people. My follow-up would be, was the closure connected to the COVID closures? One of the things that we saw in Alberta and from conversations with the other PTMAs was across the country is that when museums were forced to close, people found other jobs. And when people found other jobs, they realized they could get paid a heck of a lot more than what they could make in museums. And museums could still be a passion, but it didn't have to be their passion at a lower rate of pay. And this is kind of a comment that leads us away from closure, but to something that is facing the sector. And that's that our sector is ridiculously underpaid for what we do. And there's a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done around ensuring that compensation for the trained professionals, the masters in what they do, is equivalent to what they do, as opposed to this mentality of less, this mentality of making do. And there's advocacy work not just to be done and being done by the PTMAs about this, but also by museums themselves. It's part of how you show your relevance. It's part of how you maintain your importance within your community, is having those conversations about this is what we do. This is the level of expertise, showing what it is that's happening behind the scenes so that when closure happens, your institution has the financial support and the financial backing and investment of the community to maintain staffing through shutdowns, to avoid closure, and to, in a perfect world, compensate the staff at the correct levels.
I agree with everything that's been said.
Thank
Maybe
you.
just
And
to go
that
off
is
in
so true.
another direction, I'll speak to the savoir-faire. Again, looking at sort of our habits as a sector, we like to use the phrase museum immortality syndrome here in Nova Scotia because it's very much a thing, whether that comes from a place of trying to maintain your job security or sort of become the expert in something and the go-to person in something, but we haven't done the best job historically of making sure that knowledge is being transferred internally. We're great as let's get information out to the public through our programs and exhibits and stuff, but internally we haven't been doing a very strong job a lot of the time in terms of transferring knowledge and succession planning and that. So I think you're right. That is a real shame to lose that expertise and that masterhood in the field. Absolutely. It's totally fair to grieve that. But again, if we're taking a much more holistic approach to all of our operations, then we are making sure to set up mentoring, job shadowing, however that looks for your unique situation and circumstance, but making sure that the information that is in one person's head is actually getting disseminated throughout the organization. So if one person goes down, you're never going to replace that one person and everything they know, but hopefully it's a lot easier to actually be able to move forward and pick up some of those pieces than if it's just a big gaping hole, which is still happening far too frequently.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else? I'm going to move on. There's another question in the Q&A. What would you say are the most telling indicators for a museum at risk of closing? Attendance numbers, funding, volunteer engagement, or something else? And or something else.
Since Karin and
Lorenda, would you
Lorenda,
like to? Okay, go for it. I'm sorry,
I was
Lauren,
gonna say,
go
since
for
Karin
it.
and Lorenda have already done that, I've already jumped in to answer first. I feel like it's my turn. I would say one of the first signs for us that a museum is in trouble is that they don't renew their membership with their provincial association. Almost across the board, that is a sign that a museum is in trouble. It's either that they're not renewing their membership, they step away from the accreditation program, and they stop participating in others. And what that tells us is that when an institution who's previously been very engaged is suddenly stepping back, we know there's something going on, even if they haven't said anything to us. And that's when we generally will reach out to them and say, is everything okay? We'll do a site visit. We'll arrange something like that. So it's from the perspective of your PTMA, when you step away from us, we know there's something going on and we're worried. In terms of what to look for at your own institution, I think closure looks different for everyone. There are museums that face closure who have amazing attendance numbers, but they don't have the funding to back it up to meet the needs. There are museums that have really low attendance numbers and yet have an amazing volunteer base that keep everything going and are doing things beyond what you would track in attendance to remain relevant. The other thing that often happens is museums that are facing closure are often doing it because they didn't plan. Like Lorenda said, the best time to think about closing is when you open. The second best time is today, if you haven't already. Because then when things start to go sideways, you have a safety net. You have something in place that can help you get things back on track. There is, I would say that from what we're seeing, stepping away, engaging less with the AMA is one thing. The other thing that we see is that a lot of the institutions that we're seeing facing closure or closing are doing so because their labor, mostly volunteer, is literally dying around them. Their communities are literally dying. We have a problem in Alberta, and I'm sure it's similar in Nova Scotia and Ontario and BC, where a lot of our rural agricultural communities, the youth aren't staying. And because the youth aren't staying, they don't have people coming in a volunteer role. And those who are coming in a volunteer role are pulled in so many directions, they don't have time for the museum. And so when I say a community dying around you and a museum dying around itself, that is a sign of closure, and that is a sign of having to think about things. And I think it's important not just for people working in museums to be aware of what's happening in their community, but also for our PTMAs to really be paying attention to that. And I will say very honestly, we can't do anything about people leaving your small town. I'm really sorry, but we can support you as you navigate what that means for a really beloved institution, as many of our small rural museums are. The other one is if your institution isn't regularly reviewing its mission, vision, and values, and ensuring that it's being updated to what your community needs right now, that's a sign that you could be facing closure. If your museum was founded in the 1960s and you are still operating under the same mission statement, I strongly suggest you rethink that, because what a museum was in the 1960s is not what a museum is today. In the time that I've been in the museum sector, we've had ICOM come up with 3 different definitions of a museum, each one just different enough that it's changing the direction of our sector. So if you're still operating with something from the 60s, even if something from the 80s or the 90s, revisit it. Make sure it's relevant. Make sure it aligns with what you're actually doing, what your community actually wants you to do. That will tell you more than attendance numbers and funding if you're at risk for closure.
Robin, if I could add,
Yeah, go for it.
when we were preparing for this session, we had a practice session where we all met and chatted about the work that we're doing, and the PTMAs work very closely with our peers and the other PTMAs, and we talked about like a closure, like ideally you have a will for yourself personally, so that you have plans for your affairs when you die, and if you don't, you should look into that, because we all die. Your closure plan is planning for your museum, and just like your will, the time to do that is not when you're gone, not when it's closing. And that's you need to you just need to plan and consider for it. Like you shouldn't be waiting for signs of your museum needing to close. It should be something that you were thinking about, that you were well prepared for, that is in part of all of your work, which I know means setting aside the time and money for that. But that's, I feel like I had a better string of thought, but now I got all, I'm thinking
That's a
more
good
about
one to
other
read,
things that
though.
Lauren mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Go ahead, Robin. Do you want to say something?
no, you go ahead. No, you get front stage.
Thanks. Just jumping off of something that Lauren was saying there, about every museum is going to be a little bit different. I think that your organization will have certain markers that you are looking for that will tell whether or not you feel like you're in trouble, whether you're in trouble at risk of closure or just you're in trouble as an organization. It doesn't have to be that extreme that it's about closure. Two of the things that I really notice when we have these conversations are, going back to what I said earlier, it's the museum that is kind of getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and really focusing on what they're doing internally rather than being an active member of their community anymore. And the ones that, to quote my mom, they oh gosh, no, I'm not going to say it right. If they end up saying we've never done it that way before, and that's like an excuse to not pivot, to not try something new. She used to say, oh yeah, so the 7 dying words of an organization are, we've never done it that way before. That's what she used to say. So that's something to just keep in mind. If there is this sort of internal pushback on new ideas, pushback on making changes, I think it's important to recognize that when we go through significant change, whether that's in our museum or in our lives, whatever, we go through a grieving process with that. And so you need to navigate those changes, recognizing that it is a grieving process. That's hugely helpful. Why people are getting upset, why you might feel like they're overreacting or what have you. Those are a few things that I would watch out for, and then just try to assess the situation and figure out the best course of navigation with your PTMA, because we like to help.
Cool. Lorenda?
Robin, I got my train of thought back.
Okay, go
In
for
the
it.
way, thank you. Before I lose it again, just like people, organizations, there are sometimes telling signs that you are facing closure, that you are dying, you are diagnosed with an illness, age, but there are also unexpected deaths. And if you think of closure plans as wills and organizations as people, you can plan for it and you can not plan for it, but one way or another, death is coming for us all. And it's either going to be something you know that's happening or it's unexpected. And you having that mindset, grieving and making peace with that before you are in this crisis of closing is so important, so that you can transition through this and die gracefully, close gracefully. That was my consideration about thinking about it like a will. So thank you, Karin. You helped my thought come back together.
Oh, that's great. And when you were talking about our practice run and some of the conversation, what it reminded me of was we talked about this is not applicable just to museums. It's applicable to galleries. It's applicable to cultural heritage organizations, and now to us personally, and even to the PTMAs. We all need to think through closure and as a process by which we're planning to revitalize. It can it can take the route of revitalization, but we have to plan this all out. There's a couple of more questions in the Q&A, but one of you said something that prompted me to ask a little bit broader question, which is, how do conversations of closing museums factor into the National Museum Policy consultations? Not that very many consultations have happened, but that's an aside. Does anybody want to tackle how are not just the National Museum policy consultations, but any consultations with any level of government, because this becomes now a factor for advocacy as well as for planning. So would anyone like to tackle that? And then Shauna and O'Brien, I'll get to your questions in a minute. I promise you. Anybody want to tackle National Museums policy? One of my all-time favorite top 10 topics. Huh?
It's been so long since the sector writ large was consulted at a national level in regards to a national museum policy that the myriad of factors facing our sector has multiplied immensely. And I would say that, of course, the reality of closure is something that should be part of those conversations and should be part of those consultations. But we're also a sector that is functioning at the same funding level that we were in the 1990s in the face of inflation. And if we are not seeing investment from our governments, municipal, provincial, federal, we are going to see dying museums. It is that simple. But I don't know that PCH is considering more money. And that's an advocacy piece. And I would say, and this sort of answers one of the questions that I noticed in the Q&A, if you as a museum professional or someone who loves museums or all of the above, or just someone who loves museums, cares about this, write some letters. Write to your MPs, write to your MLAs. It can't just be the PTMAs who are doing that work. We need it coming from the ground too. And we need those things to be brought to the attention more often. In Alberta, one of the things that we face is that our definition of museum includes absolutely everybody with a collection. We don't care if it's alive, we don't care if it's dead, we don't care if it's art or anything in between. If you have a collection, If you dug it out of the ground, you're part of our definition. And what we've noticed is that our arts sector in Alberta has done a really, really good job of getting money and getting funding and getting support. So our gallery members tend to be in stronger places than our purely museum members.
Yep.
And it's because the arts sector writes letters. Their patrons write letters. Their staff write letters. They make government care. And when you make government care, government will budget for you. Whether it's the National Museum Policy or Provincial Museum Policy, any of that stuff, write letters. I think we have some templates on the Reconsidering Museums pieces that you just literally fill in the blanks, making it as easy as possible. But do it.
I'm
I
going to
think
make
that's it.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. I know we've, let's be honest, some politicians are going to be more friendly than others. Okay. So thinking of an experience we had with one of the less friendly politicians, we were literally told, well, this is your job to advocate for museums. So that kind of means it just doesn't count because you're being paid to do this. It's a non-issue. But if they hear from the taxpayers, if they're hearing from those really passionate volunteers, if they're hearing from your board members, then those are people who are not being paid to do that advocacy work. And that doesn't mean that all politicians react that way. That's just like the super negative scenario. But I think it's an important one for us to keep in mind because your PTMAs are working super, super hard for you in this area, and encouraging you all to get on board, like with Reconsidering Museums and different individual advocacy efforts. It's so important, even though we're all burnt out and so busy with everything, to join in on those efforts, but not just join in as like, oh, right, I'm the curator, it's my job to do this stuff. Making sure that information is flowing through to those board members and those volunteers who are not paid to do that kind of advocacy effort. So critical. I was also thinking as you were talking, this kind of reminded me from our practice chat, that notion of permanence, and maybe that's worth bringing up here and encouraging us to again make like a little shift in understanding of permanence, because on the part of the public, on the part of politicians, there is this assumption that museums are permanent. And I think it would be very healthy for us to get away from that because nothing is permanent. And I know, Lauren, you were speaking about the actual like definition of that within ICOM and different professional guidelines, that it doesn't mean we're around forever. So we need to sort of remove that element of that conversation from our brains, basically.
That's what
Absolutely. So
that's what I was going to echo, Karen, is that there are so many people, government, visitors, volunteers, members, just people in the community who I don't think realize that museums can close, that they can face closure. And it's not like communicating that is not, I mean, sometimes it's like a threat, like if you don't fund us, we will close. Well, not a threat, but like a plea. But I think having that discourse that museums aren't just here, they aren't just funded mysteriously behind the scenes and staffed somehow, that we need community engagement, we need advocacy, we need other people advocating for us and not just us, but we also need funding or we will close, and what that looks like. I think that's where it comes back to the National Museum Policy, is that I don't know for sure if people making these decisions know that we are potentially going to close. Like, we aren't here forever. And the BCMA, Robin, also uses the broadest term of museums. It's the biggest umbrella just to catch pretty much everyone. We've got it on our website. It's quite a lengthy paragraph of all of the organizations that we recognize under that term.
yeah. The PTMAs, when I first joined here 8 months ago, so 7 or 8 months ago, there was a consultation with the PTMAs, but it was once, and the final conclusion was, thank you very much, but there's no money to actually implement any new National Museum policy, even though we'll write one. So, and I'm basically paraphrasing the final comment. And speaking of advocacy, I'm going to put in a little plug for November the 30th is our advocacy panel discussion with great speakers as well. If you're okay with this, I'm going to return to the Q&A, and Shauna is asking, is there a concern that with people leaving the sector due to the lack of compensation and burnout, that museums will start to close because there is no longer trained people in the sector to keep the organization going? Is there anything we can do to try to fix the problem before it gets worse? And I think that is based on some of your previous conversation about staff leaving. Anyone want to jump into Shauna's question? All right.
Yes.
Go ahead, Lorenda.
Just yes. It is a concern. I mean,
Yes, okay.
we've talked. Just, yeah, funding, sustainable funding is a concern both for organizations' operations, but also for staff. And that ties back to the previous question about the person who left the organization and became a trucker. If people are able to find better salaries and careers outside of the sector, despite where their passions may lay, we will have that brain drain and that departure. If you have staff who are overextended consistently and they are burning out, they will depart. And you might not have people who are able to come in to refill their places because they sought different careers and different training in different areas. You also may not be able to fill those positions because you do not have enough money to pay them. And that is most likely not your organization's fault. You probably can only pay them that much because that is what you have in your budget, but it is a cyclical nature of funding, systemic funding, long-lasting funding in our sector that can, and I mean, even Karen, when we were talking about silos and that training for succession, if you don't have the money to make the time to make sure other people know what you do, to train people into that role, then you're just, despite how much you might want to do that, you're going to be stuck with someone eventually departing and all that information leaving with them. So short answer, yes.
I think in terms of something you
Okay.
can do is you need to have a serious look at your organization and what activities you have on the go, and see what's really working for you and what's not working for you, because we need to address the burnout, right? Lack of compensation, huge issue. It might feel like something that's a bit out of your reach right now, depending on your role in the organization. But if you can try and help have some conversations about what you're doing and what the community needs actually are, what activities you're engaged in that are really meeting those needs, versus sometimes we just assign a sort of sacred status to something because we've been doing it for years. So heaven forbid we release that activity, that, Christmas dinner or this particular fundraiser or whatever it is. We need to remove the sacred status we've assigned to our programs and our activities and just say, okay, everything's on the table. We're all feeling burnt out. We can't keep operating this way. How do we adjust?
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Aurelie O'Brien's question. Do you feel there are times museums should think about or consider closing, and what does that look like? Which I think was a question previously, but her question has been fine-tuned. Would anyone like to have a go at that question?
Just thinking back to that practice session, I can jump in with something. Lorenda has already mentioned, when you open, think about it. It's an important time. I think earlier I said today would be a good time to start if you haven't already. But the other time that's really good to think about closure is actually when you're in a place of strength. When your institution
Yes.
is in a place of strength, it's a really good time to think about what weakness looks like, because that's also generally a time when you have the resources available to start working on things like contingency funds. Something that we inherently know, but often neglect is that closing costs a lot of money. And if you have not planned to close when you had the funds to put some aside, it's not going to go well. Each of our provinces has very strict regulations about how much severance you have to pay people based on how long they've been with your organization. If you're in a larger organization and you have people who've been there for a decade or more, the severance you will have to pay to those people if you have to close is huge. So when you're in a place of strength, when you're well funded, when you're running surpluses, those surpluses can become your rainy day. Those surpluses can become the contingency that if you're a nonprofit, your board needs to wrap up their operations, because there are very specific expenses that go to what a board needs to do. Your surpluses can go to what your operations need to wrap up. And I say this not as a do as I say, not as I do. I say this because it's what the AMA has done. We know that our funding could disappear if the government decides museums aren't worth it anymore. And we have to be able to look after our people, and we have to be able to look after our members. So when we were in a place of strength, we set up contingency funds with policies around when you put money into them. And by saying things like, when you have a surplus, it's recommended that this percentage goes into contingency, ensures that those funds continue to grow. And there are also funds that we can't touch unless we're like literally about to close. So it's saved for those times. And like I said, it was done from a time and a place of strength. And it gives us a little bit of peace of mind when, we're waiting in August for the government to give us money they said they would give us in February. And I'm sure, like, when I say that, a lot of you probably feel that too. A funder says they're going to give you some money, and then months later, you're like, come on, guys, where's the money? We need it. People had to get paid. So yeah, that's a good time to think about it. Another good time to think about it is when you do any emergency planning. And you should be thinking about emergency planning right now. If you need a template, we've got some on our website. You literally just write your information in. We have a whole book about it too, if you really want to dig deep. But all the tearouts from our help manual are available for free on our website. Use them. Because when you go through the process of planning for an emergency or a disaster, you're really going through a process of what does the worst case scenario look like? And the things you have to consider when you're facing a disaster are surprisingly similar to what you have to consider when you're looking at closure.
Yeah.
And it's a quiet disaster time of year. So
perfect. Excellent. Lorenda, do you want to talk? I see your hand. Go for it.
If I might add, I'm going to put in the chat, there's a book that I read in preparation for the resource that we wrote, and it's called How to Close a Museum, A Practical Guide. If you're interested and have the time and you want to read it, you can read it. It's a great guide. I believe her closure took a year and a half, 2 years. And that is time that they were not open to the public. They had closed, and that's how long it took to deal with their staff and their collections. So not only does it take money in regards to your staff and severance and board, it takes money because you need to have a place for your things during that time of transitioning your collections out. There are options when you take session and close that are laid out in what you can do with your collection. I know the ANSM's resource covers it as well. But you need space to do that. Your collection doesn't just disappear. So if your lease is up, you're going to have to find a new space to move to put those things in because you don't have the building you were in. But you need the money because you are going to need to have people help you with that. You need to pay for the cost of those spaces. And yeah, you need the time. so that those are things that you need to consider when you are looking at this closure, and why we keep stressing that you should plan for it now. Because when you are in the time of closing and you are realizing that this is going to be a multi-year process, and that you should have set the money aside for this far earlier in times of plenty, is so stressful, and you don't need to put that stress on yourself or any future folks at your organization.
Thank you very much. I'm going to the next question, Madeline. And yes, Madeline, I am in Toronto. That was a side question, by the way. What happens to artifacts that have been bequeathed or willed to an institution? What is the best outcome, and what are some potential situations to be aware of? Now, there is a question and a half. Who would like to have the fun of answering that one?
I'll kick that one off. I like collections.
Thank you,
I think
Karen.
sometimes we assign sort of special status to objects that have been bequeathed or willed, and at the end of the day, they're just gifts, the same as any others. The caveat there, which applies to any donations, is whether or not there were conditions set with those donations. That is covered, not to try and just like push back our toolkit, but where we do have a nice section on legal considerations, and Peter, the lawyer we worked with, wrote out some very lovely, like, simple language explanations of considerations in this area. So I would direct you there for sure. The best outcome, obviously, is if things can stay in the public domain. That's wonderful. As we've been saying, you should be having conversations with your community, with neighboring museums. From, if you haven't done it already, starting now. Who is out there? Who might be a good fit for your collection to go to, in whole or in part, and start talking about how that could work, that transfer process. We've had a couple examples of that in Nova Scotia, and in two of them, an entire collection went to a neighboring museum. They were in neighboring communities. Their mandates were very similar, so it was sort of a very natural fit. They still had a lot of conversations, a lot of things they had to figure out. This is not a simple process by any stretch, but they were able to navigate that and figure it out. Another situation was very piecemeal, where it was more like almost item by item. Okay, where should this go? Where should this go? And having to do a lot of back and forth. Now you can see how the time is going to stretch for this process, right? If you're having to work with multiple institutions. Potential situations to be aware of. I feel like this came up in our practice chat, but here in Nova Scotia, we've definitely heard that there's a misunderstanding around, like, the provincial museum would just take the collection of a community museum if it were to close. They won't. Like, they don't know where that came from. They're saying, like, whoa, cease and desist, like that. We never said that. We never made any promises. We never made any commitments. At best, we would come and look at what is there. So I have seen numerous policies where that is the statement that the board has put into a policy. Well, no, if we dissolve, then the collection's just going to go there. It's not. That's not a given. So you need to be sort of analyzing your collection, looking at who is out there, who could be a good fit, and having conversations with these organizations. And that's just part of healthy collections management.
Thank you very much.
Just to echo Karen,
Go ahead.
yes, in our conversation, I've seen a lot of collections management policies that clearly say, if we close, we're going to give our stuff to the Royal Alberta Museum. The Royal Alberta Museum doesn't know that, and they don't have the space for it. And I would say that is true of any big museum. You may think they have the space, but they have the same problems that you do with space. But if you know in advance, if you have been doing really good reconciliation within your collections, and you know what's in there, you should have a list of those objects that have stipulations on them, that are restricted in one way or another. And when you're facing closure, make those your priority, because you have an obligation within that gift agreement to maintain those conditions. This is also a push to not just blanket accept conditional bequests, because they're going to cause you problems when it comes to closure or the need to deaccession or anything like that. The other thing I would mention is that if your institution is looking to close, start your conversations. Start your conversations now. Start deaccessioning what's not essential. One of the institutions that I worked with here in Alberta had a very, very specific collections. It came from the old Edmonton telephones. So they had a lot of telephones from Edmonton and things that go with telephones from Edmonton. And they got really lucky that the city artifact center was able to take those. Because when they approached the provincial museum, they wanted a few, but not all. And they didn't want to take apart the collection. For them, it was very important to maintain that collection as a whole. So you have to think about that too. If it's important your collection is maintained as a whole, have conversations now about places that would be willing and have the capacity to take that on if you had to close. And maybe it's something that's reciprocal, but again, have the conversation early. Don't wait until the 11th hour when, you have to have everything out of your space by midnight and it's 11:30. Start thinking about that now and get to know your collection.
I think there's there are a couple
Very
good points to jump off on you there, Lauren. One is that if your museum has been offered a bequest, it's just an offer. You do not have to accept it. And I've also heard from multiple museums that thought they had to accept something that was put in someone's will for them. You don't have to. It's an offer like any other for you to consider. And then the other thing in terms of trying to position yourself well is dealing with those old loans that are kicking around too, because that's, like I said earlier, a huge elephant in the room. And it's really scary for people to face. But if you can start clearing that up, that also positions you much better and also clears out some space that, is at a premium in your museum. And we have a toolkit for that. I'll go find the link for you.
Thank you very much. The next question from Adrienne Jolie is, do you have any example of a shift that saved a museum?
Yes.
I see heads saying yes. So, Lauren, would you like to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. We have an example. We actually just awarded our Sustainability Leadership Award to the museum for doing exactly this. We have a little town here in Alberta called Mirror, and in the pandemic, their museum was facing closure. One of the board members reached out to us and said, like, this is what's going on. They were very honest and open, which is really important if you're facing closure. Like, if you need help for your PTMA, you got to tell us everything. We need the full set of facts. So they were really open and honest, and they said, if we want to turn this around, what do we do? How do we do that? So we worked with them, and we talked to them about sustainability, about what needs to be in place, and this person took it on and basically rebuilt their museum board, re-engaged with the community. And while they've retired and moved to a different province in their retirement, they still are mentoring the new board members and the new volunteers so that they can help maintain that work that's gone into saving the institution. And they were like literally the doors about to close. But they decided to not just say we can't because we've never done it that way before. They decided to say let's do it different. And they saved their museum. And this is something that the first email I got from them was in like November of 2020. And by the beginning of 2023, they'd completely remade their institution. Small volunteer-run museum.
Good.
So there's an example. I'm sure Karin has a few too, and Lorenda.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Every example I could give, they basically did the same thing, just in a slightly different way. They admitted to their community that they were really, really struggling and they didn't see a way forward. And they said, can we please talk about this? And they had a little gathering of some kind, and people came in that were interested in having this conversation. And collectively, as a community, they figured out a path forward. And every time that did mean a changeover in who was involved, whether that's, you know, all the old crew stayed and they got an influx of new people, or some people who were burnt out said, okay, that's like, I don't have the skill sets to do this work that everyone's identified needs to be done. I'm going to step away and I'm going to hand the reins to someone else. It's functioned differently at each site, but that's really what it was, is just open transparency, real conversations with the community about what the community wanted this museum to be and how it could serve the needs of the community every single time.
And another one that I'll
Good.
bring up, just because it's a bit of a different approach, is that this is pre-pandemic. Sorry if everything in my life is now pre and post-pandemic, as I'm sure it is for everyone. This is a pre-pandemic example that's been ongoing. We have a community, Southern Alberta, that is small and has multiple heritage institutions that are all relying on the same set of volunteers. And while the museums themselves were doing okay, one was doing a bit better than the other in the town, the volunteers were burnt out. They were struggling to get enough people to have quorum on their boards, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but is a thing that can lead to potential closure. So these two groups got together and said, well, instead of competing with each other, why don't we work together? And started in 2020, 2021, a process of merging two institutions into one. I'm not clear at where they're at on this, so I'm not going to say who they are. But that's their plan, is to have one executive director that can oversee both the sites. They're not in the same towns, they're in like next door to each other towns. But it means that they have one board instead of two. And it means that their community isn't trying to staff 3 heritage boards, only 2, maybe 1 if their plans go as far as they're hoping. But that's a way to do it, especially if you're in a rural area that is overstretched in terms of what volunteers have capacity for. This is only a success because those 2 institutions had relationships already, and they were good relationships. This is also a little bit of a prompt to be friendly with your neighbors, because you never know when you might need each other and might have to help each other out. But that's just kind of an alternative to closure that can happen. It's going to cost money. Mergers and amalgamations are a big investment, like a closure is, but it's a way that maintains the collections and maintains those sites and maintains the services that they're able to.
We have a great example like that, and which came out of those community conversations, where 4 organizations that were in the same little town, and you're thinking, how on earth did that town support 4 museums, came together. They didn't just, you know, merge, and that was a great thing though. Through that process, they were able to access funding, and they ended up saving what was the old creamery building as a result. So this industrial site that was kind of starting to look a little rough, they ended up moving into that. So they preserved some of their built heritage in this process of a merger, and now it is like the go-to thing in their community. They've got a market, they've got an art space, they've got the museum space with 4 museums under one roof. So once you start having those conversations, who knows what can happen? Like really, really great things sometimes.
So this might be the last question before we start the wrap up. I have seen a decline of living history sites across the province during my time as a museum worker. From what I can tell from speaking with people from those sites, pressure to cut funding leads to staff cuts, leads to bare bones living history approach, or a shift to static displays. At the same time, a common complaint from visitors is the lack of staff and the feeling of being a ghost town. This creates a cycle where declining revenue leads to further cuts, et cetera, et cetera. It's a cycle. But With the result of a budget process, living history can be great experiential learning model, but difficult business model. And several sites have changed focus to other kinds of museums. Do you have any thoughts of having a decline or closure as part of your museum while maintaining others? Okay, I see Karin nodding. Do you want to go first on that one, Karin?
I think this goes back to a couple of things, and I noticed there's a comment in the chat as well about this. This is all part of those serious, open, transparent conversations that you have with your community about where you are at as an organization, what you've been doing, and how you figure out a path forward. Absolutely, you can close down part of your operations and maintain others, depending on what those are and the conversations with your community. Like that's a very unique thing. So it's not like we could give you a formula and say, oh, keep this and get rid of that. Your community is unique, so you can figure that out with them about what is priority and what could maybe change. We've seen museums that have closed parts of their operations down temporarily, whether that was during COVID or whether that's okay, we didn't get the grant we thought we were going to get to keep this program or this service running, so that means that, sorry guys, we're not going to be able to do that this year. We need to be a lot more open about the patchwork of grants that keeps us afloat. We need to be advocating more. And quite frankly, if you do have to make a major cut somewhere, then you can use that as an advocacy tool. And you don't have to feel embarrassed about it. You don't have to feel really depressed about it. It's a reality. And until we step out of the introversion and into the extroversion, be like, nope, okay, we're going to say this is where we're at. It's going to be hard to make a change there.
Good. Excellent. I was going to have that as the last question, but this last question actually, I think, hits the nail on the head. Given that we face challenges with ongoing funding support from all levels of government, perhaps it is time that the industry, i.e. the museum industry, would benefit from the loss of unsustainable museums. It certainly happens in the private sector with mergers and companies being bought out. How's that for a concluding question or comment?
I'll take a whack.
Would the three of you like to go for it, Lorenda?
Just because I think it's in the spirit of the messaging that I've been sending. I love the sector that I work in. I count myself so lucky that since university, I've known what I've wanted to do, which is work in museums, and I've been really lucky to be able to do that. I love what I do, and I think I'm good at it. And I know that our sector is full of people who love what they do and who think that they are good at their job, and I believe that they are. But putting that aside, as I've communicated, the natural life cycle is that some museums do close, whether that's emergencies, whether that's climate disasters, whether that is lack of funding, lack of people, lack of place. It is sad, and we absolutely should grieve them, but museums can and should close. I don't think that all museums should close, museums broadest terms, and I think that there are a lot of organizations who might be at the brink of closure who could explore other options so that they do not close. And I think this ties really well into that question about the living history sites. Burnaby Village Museum is a 10-acre site with staff in costume doing interpretation, not as third person. But it's a place that I worked for 5 years. I understand that experience. But sites that are big, that have lots of people, they can explore alternative models like seasonal openings. But there are museums that might be facing closure that will close and should close. And what you should consider is how you're going to close well, how you can communicate that to your staff, how you can communicate that to your volunteers, to your community, to your commitments if you're a place that is used for rentals, and how you can take care of your collections and people as you transition into what will be the next cycle of the life cycle of your organization. A closure might be what's happening right now, but you might reopen in a different capacity somewhere else. But yeah, their museum should and can and will close. And we will miss them,
Thank
but
you
we love
very,
them.
very much.
just to
We
kind
love
of,
them.
can I just there's an
Go for it.
idea in Robert James's new book. I'll stick the link for the book in the chat. It's called Museums and Societal Collapse: The Museum as Lifeboat. And within that, he floats this idea of hospicing museums. And I agree with Lorenda. It's really sad when a museum has to close, but sometimes they have to close. And it's okay. And the more we talk about it, the more our sector gets used to it being okay for things to not be permanent in the etched in stone kind of way. Within this idea of hospicing museums is about respect, empathy, and realism. And when we think about the end of life of a museum in the same terms as a hospice, it helps us bring that empathy, respect, and realism to the process, and helps us take closure from a scary place to a this is just part of what we do place. And yes, there are institutions that will need to close. And going into the pandemic, we were seeing institutions closing. Coming out of it, we're still seeing institutions closing. What matters is that we do it well, like Lorenda has said, like Karin has said. And that if your institution is looking at that, if you're afraid it's going to happen, always remember that you have support. Your PTMAs want to help you. They will hold your hand as you have to close. It'll make us sad, but sometimes it's what you have to do.
Thank you very, very much. Anyone else want to make a no pun intended closing remark?
I would just I just want to echo that. That was beautifully. It's like, oh man, Lauren just summed it up perfectly. But yeah, your PTMAs are here to help, but so are your colleagues and your peers in other museums. And whether you have a regional group that networks and gets together and talks about something, or you just through your own personal professional network have people that you talk to, I think the most important point here is that we need to not be afraid to have these conversations. And when we have these conversations, then if you're in that really, really tough spot, there could be an alternative option, or there could be, you know, an idea that someone says. You just never know where solutions might be sitting or hiding. The importance is to just be really open and have these conversations and figure out the best path forward with your community, for your museum, for your organization. That's the most important thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, on behalf of the board of directors and staff and everybody, I want to thank Karin, Lorenda, and Lauren for this amazing and excellent conversation. And they are right. We need to continue this conversation. We cannot be afraid of this. It's a hard topic, but it's a very important topic. So let's keep the conversation going. There is a survey, so click on the survey, please. But on a personal note, this is my last week at the OMA, and I want to thank everybody for your support and ideas during my term of service. But much more excitedly, please join me in welcoming our new executive director, Sandy Chan, who is just a remarkable professional. And I applaud her coming. And I am enjoying, and I look forward to continuing to work with her. And last but not least, this fall series of workshops and panel discussions continue. Next week, November the 1st, is a very important topic about more than a checklist, decolonizing historical narratives in museum spaces. It is with Skyly Storm and with Krista McCracken, who are well respected and have done courses and workshops on this topic extensively, and they're just downright good people. They're lovely people to work with. In the middle of November, we have Dr. Irene Chambers coming in doing exhibition label writing, but within the context of decolonizing narratives in museums and galleries. And last but not least, and very important for this conversation, advocacy. On November the 30th is advocacy, multifaceted, and that's with three excellent speakers. Heather George, who is the Executive Director of Woodland Cultural Center, Sarah McKenzie, who is Executive Director of the Ottawa Museums Network, and Michael Wrigley Lancaster, who is Executive Director of the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum. I always love saying that. But he is also going to be the new Vice President of the OMA board. All three of them are going to be taking totally different approaches to advocacy. So once again, please join me in thanking Karin, Lorenda, and Lauren for this excellent conversation on a very difficult but a critical topic for all of us as museum and gallery and heritage organization workers. Click that survey button and have a wonderful fall. And thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to seeing you for our future workshop. So thank you very much for everything. Thank you.